Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dylan Corbett, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hope Border Institute. I want to welcome you this morning and thank you for joining us for this very exciting webinar on Latinx identity, immigration enforcement, and the current political moment. I'm really looking forward to this webinar because of the quality of our presenters, Dr. Luis Fraga, Dr. David Cortez, and Marisa Limon Garza, who will be introduced here shortly, but also because of the timeliness of today's content. This month in El Paso, we're remembering the massacre and hate crime that was visited upon our community 1 year ago by a white supremacist. What happened was directly connected with a politics of hate and xenophobia that's characterized the past several years of our public life in the United States, and which is long overdue for a definitive reckoning. The same toxic effects of white supremacy and a racist politics was currently on display in our country this week in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And in the past several months, it's become clear that as a nation, we still require a deep reckoning with an ingrained culture of white supremacy and its connection with the deployment of state violence, both here at the border and in the interior of the country. For all those who've lost their lives to hate, I invite you now to join me in a moment of silence to ground us in the seriousness of the current moment and to seek the strength to move forward together towards a more just world. Thank you. Welcome again, and a most generous bienvenidos y bienvenidas to all of you and to our presenters today.
Thank you, Dylan, and thank you everyone who's joined us on this webinar. We are greatly appreciative of the Hope Border Institute and the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame for helping bring together this dynamic panel presentation and a current political assessment of where we are and how identity kind of intersects with immigration enforcement. So we're ready for a robust conversation. A reminder to all of our webinar attendees, please be free to use the chat function that we have available. We will be using Q&A at the end of our programming, so please make sure you drop that in. I'm also going to share my screen quickly to be able to get you some additional information. Reminders for folks as we go through our presentation, we'll be able to make sure that we are hitting on all of the major themes of importance. So we will begin by setting the stage. I'll offer a brief introduction and Dr. Luis Fraga will begin by helping ground ourselves in this current political moment. We'll then go on and hear from Dr. David Cortez on his research on Latinx identity and immigration enforcement, and then we'll have time for question and answers. And so as far as who we are, I'm really proud to be part of this panel of esteemed presenters, particularly as an alumna of the University of Notre Dame myself and a proud member of the Hispanic Alumni of Notre Dame. It brings me great pride to have such thought leadership be part of the work that's happening here in the borderlands as well. When I was a small note, personal reference, when I was graduating from the university of my undergraduate school, that was when the Institute for Latino Studies was just getting established. So that's 20 years ago. But it was an emotional time for me to be able to know that students that would come after me would be able to access this type of scholarship, and to see how Dr. Fraga and his team of fellows and scholars and advocates and allies have done such a tremendous job brings me great joy. So today, you'll be hearing from Luis Ricardo Fraga. He is the Reverend Donald P. McNeil CSC Professor of Transformative Latino Leadership, the Joseph and Elizabeth Robbie Professor of Political Science, the Director of the Institute for Latino Studies and Fellow at the Institute for Educational Initiatives at the University of Notre Dame. He's been on the faculty at the University of Washington, Stanford University, and the University of Oklahoma, and he's a native of Corpus Christi, Texas. He received his A.B. cum laude from Harvard University and his M.A. and Ph.D. from Rice. His primary interests are in American politics, where he specializes in the politics of race and ethnicity, Latino politics, immigration policy, education politics, voting rights policy, and urban politics. His most recent co-authored book is Latinos in the New Millennium, an almanac of opinion, behavior, and policy preferences. In 2011, President Barack Obama appointed him to the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanics, where he also served as co-chair of the Post-Secondary Education Committee. He's a past vice president of the American Political Science Association and was also co-chair of the Presidential Task Force on Political Science in the 21st Century of the APSA. Fraga has received a number of teaching, advising, mentoring, and service awards at each institution where he has served. In 2018, he received the Lifetime Achievement for Excellence Community Service Award from the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF. Pretty impressive. Dr. David Cortez is our second presenter, and he's an assistant professor of political science and a faculty fellow with the Institute for Latino Studies at Notre Dame. Motivated by his own experiences growing up in Brownsville, Texas, his current book project explores the emergence of a disproportionately Latinx immigration law enforcement workforce as a metaphor for the minority experience in the United States. Drawing on extensive fieldwork, including interviews with and observations of more than 100 immigration and customs agents across Texas, Arizona, and California, his research engages questions of belonging, obligation, and liminality to reveal the careful negotiation of cross-cutting social group memberships of Latinx immigration agents caught between two worlds, the police and the policed. Cortez is an alumnus of the American Political Science Association Ralph Bunche Summer Institute, and his research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the American Political Science Association Minority Fellowship Program. Cortez earned his BA in Political Science and History at the University of Texas Pan American and holds a master's and PhD in government from Cornell. He was a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. Definitely an exemplary group of people that you will be hearing from today. A few reminders before we get started. Make sure you drop your questions into the chat or use the Q&A function. Visit hopeborder.org and make sure you sign up for more content like this. It's our pleasure to make sure that this is available for you all. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Luis Fraga.
Thank you very much, Marisa, and thank you to Dylan as well. And of course, thank you to my dear friend and colleague, David Cortez, for all of us being able to get together today. I thought I might, for setting the context for what Dr. Cortez will address, suggest to us that the level of hostile vitriol and the severity of that vitriol, and that vitriol coming from the White House throughout the time of the current administration and even extending back to the campaign for president in 2016, and perhaps even characterizing important elements of the campaign of 2020, we might think is unique. We might think is different. We might think is strange. And it is. It is in some ways, and it's not that unique in other ways. We can go back at least to 1798 and the passage of the Alien Act, when the United States, for the first time, with a focus on French radicals, what were called French radicals, we hear the term radical being used today, were prevented from becoming citizens of the United States with extended residency requirements, very much subject to deportation. We can go back to 1882 and the Chinese Exclusion Act that prevented Chinese from coming to the United States, although they had come in before. We can go back to the 1924 National Origins Law, what was called the Johnson-Reed Act, that established quotas that favored Europeans in coming to the United States. We, of course, cannot forget the Mexican repatriation efforts driven by the White House that occurred from 1929 to 1936, the executive order that happened in 1942 that interned Japanese at the same time that we were establishing a bilateral relationship between Mexico and the US to establish the Bracero program. And in 1954, we had Operation Wetback that sent 1.3 million Mexicanos back to the United States, and many Mexicano-Americano, Mexican Americans as well. My point is, we have a long history of discrimination by our national government, of targeting of among our most vulnerable populations, immigrant populations, at times focused on undocumented populations, and at times focused just on Latino, Latina, Latinx populations generally, to try to rid the country of individuals who were defined as unworthy and oftentimes also defined as unassimilable in the United States. So that the uniqueness that we see today under the current administration is in fact unique in terms of the White House severity of that vitriol, but the sentiment of working against the interests of immigrants, and we might say other immigrant origin communities like Latinx communities, is something that has defined us as a nation for a very long period of time. Now, there are examples of the United States also being more inclusive in its immigration policy. For example, in 1960, with the Cuban refugee order, we accepted many refugees from Cuba until very recently under very special circumstances and special support. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act got rid of those quotas that I talked about, established in 1924, and established a more equalized system for immigrants to the United States. And certainly we know that the more recent 1986 Immigration and Enforcement Act allowed for millions of undocumented people to be able to apply for legalization and use that legalization to ultimately receive green cards as resident aliens and then become citizens of the United States. So we have this bifurcated, if you will, relationship with immigrant communities, while at the same time, and most of the time, we have been suspicious of them. At other times, we have embraced them as important contributors to American society. Just a couple of final points before I leave it to Professor Cortés. These trends of anti-immigration legislation have at times replicated themselves, and at times even more severely, in state policy. Whether it was the original Proposition 187 in California in 1987, or the more recent Show Me Your Papers policy that was pursued, I believe, in the state of Arizona in 2017. It certainly has been the case that states have become important actors in expressing anti-immigrant policies and practices. Now, under the current administration, we know that there was a travel ban from Muslim countries that was instituted in September 2017. We know that in 2017, that same year, the president announced an end of DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Although that was subsequently overturned in court decisions, it is still something that may be there, and new DACA recipients are not being accepted. And we know that he removed the temporary protected status, although that's still being challenged in the courts, in 2018. Affecting Haitians, Salvadorians, and Hondurans. But nothing is more reflective of the anti-immigrant attitude of the current administration than the separation of children and families at the border that occurred. Nothing was as heart-wrenching. Nothing was as immoral as tearing children away from the arms of their parents, as a way of trying to make a symbolic statement that immigrants were no longer welcome, especially those from Central America and from Mexico. And you know that the Hope Border Institute has done incredible work in that regard. Well, all of this is to set the context for trying to understand who is it that actually implements these policies? Who is it that has the responsibility for trying to interpret these policies and applying them in the current political moment? Who are the people who, in quotes, enforce the border? And it is that, and how do they understand their work? It is that type of insight, that type of understanding that the work of Professor Cortés brings to all of us, and that he has so graciously agreed to share with us today. Professor Cortés.
Thank you so much, Luis, and thank you, Marisa, and the Hope Border Institute for inviting me to take part in this panel today. I'm thrilled to be able to share what is an ongoing book project with you, a little snippet from it that's available in my most recent article published by Political Research Quarterly. You can find that at my website. Talk a little bit about why it is that Latinos join La Migra. Now, you notice rather quickly here, I just want to offer a disclaimer that the use of the term Latinx is still very much open for discussion. We've seen in recent weeks survey instruments actually picking up on the extent to which people use this term, identify in this way. I want to make a statement here and let you all know that you will hear from me out loud the term Latino. This is the term that I use in particular, but use Latinx on my slides, in my writing, to actually make space in that writing for people to read their own preferred gender identity into the term Latinx. So while you're looking at these slides, you might read them as Latino, Latine, Latina. And so I just wanted to make that clear before we go ahead and get started here. So today, more than any period in history, the front lines of federal immigration law enforcement agencies reflect the demographics of the populations they police. Across the agencies charged with immigration law enforcement, namely Border Patrol and ICE under the Department of Homeland Security, Latinos are overrepresented relative to their proportion of both the overall federal workforce and the general population. With Immigration and Customs Enforcement ERO, or ICE, at nearly 30% Latino, and Border Patrol nearly 50%. Once an exclusively white enterprise, viewed for much of the 20th century as a foreign occupying force in border communities and referred to somewhat pejoratively as La Migra, the last 40 to 50 years have witnessed the emergence of a much different immigration law enforcement workforce, what I've taken to calling the new Latino Migra. Well, now perhaps most fascinating about this demographic shift is that it's taken place in the context that it has. Amidst a historically problematic relationship between Latino communities and immigration law enforcement agencies. A relationship marred by violence and intimidation, some of which Luis just described a bit ago, and a relationship that was characterized essentially not necessarily by agencies that simply policed migration, but that indiscriminately blanketed Latino communities in a shroud of surveillance, policing, and battlefield technology. Consider, for instance, the dirigible drones you see here hovering over communities in my home of South Texas. Now, it's important to note that these pictures weren't taken 20 or 30 years ago. Rest assured, that's simply a filter on those pictures. These were taken in the last 5 years. I highlight this point to demonstrate the fact that despite the emergence of a less ethnically and racially homogenous immigration law enforcement workforce, the new Latino Migra find themselves today the stewards of a long-standing, but more importantly, ongoing racial project that continues to tie Latino identity to criminality and violently relegate Latinos in the communities in which they live to a perpetual state of otherness. In this light, the emergence of a disproportionately Latino immigration workforce is puzzling. If you're asking yourself, okay, how do we make sense of this? Rest assured that you're not alone. You're actually precisely where I was nearly 8 years ago when I started working on this research, beginning with the simple question of why do Latinos work in La Migra? Why do they join La Migra? Or more precisely, why do Latinos elect to work for agencies that not only have, but continue to systematically target the communities to which they belong? This question is at the center of my most recent article, as I mentioned before, in Political Research Quarterly, and also the central thrust of the talk today. To that end, the rest of the talk is going to proceed as follows. I'm going to walk through some of the previous studies dealing with Latinos in immigration law enforcement before getting to how this work contributes to those previous studies, And then I'll walk you through what it is that I actually did to put my research in progress before getting to a discussion of what I actually found, which is probably the most fascinating part of this. And then getting into what the implications are of this research. And of course, as has been mentioned before, we'll open the floor up to questions. So it probably goes without saying, but I'm not the first person to ask these kinds of questions. Motivated, no doubt, by the same kind of apparent contradictions as I am, scholars have made considerable efforts to understand how Latino agents interact with ostensibly co-ethnic clientele, how they understand their institutional roles, and how they understand themselves. But despite the significant scholarly attention garnered by the emergence of a disproportionately Latino immigration workforce, little theorizing and empirical evidence has been brought to bear on explaining it. And as a result, today we know quite a bit about why Latinos, or how Latinos work in immigration law enforcement, but significantly less about why. Ultimately, the lack of a dedicated empirical assessment of the precise motivations that lead Latinos to join La Migra, we're left to draw inferences from previous work, where just as much as scholars have suggested that Latinos may enter immigration law enforcement to prove thorough assimilation or in service of socioeconomic motivations, scholars have simultaneously suggested that Latinos may self-select into immigration work due to a dissociation with ethnic identity, limited identification with the immigrant experience, and/or particular attitudes toward immigration, in this case, restrictionist immigration attitudes. Teasing through these potential explanations is one of the central goals of my research. So why might we think that Latinos self-select into immigration law enforcement? Well, previous studies have found that and presented this image of Latino immigration agents as disassociated from ethnic identity in some cases, disconnected from the co-ethnic migrants they encounter, and far removed from the immigrant experience, and possessing of particular restrictionist immigration attitudes. What we might infer from such findings is that those Latinos who opt into immigration law enforcement do so specifically because they fit this mold. To the extent that this is a common prevailing assumption about those Latinos who enter immigration law enforcement, consider how many times you may have heard Latinos who work in immigration referred to as self-hating race traitors or vendidos, or people who have forgotten where they came from. In fact, when I was putting this work together and submitting it for review for potential publication, a reviewer actually responded with, well, why would we expect any differently? Why would we expect the Latinos who opt into immigration law enforcement not to feel disconnected from their ethnic identity, not to feel a particular way about undocumented immigration? But is this actually the case? My own understanding of the border region suggested it wasn't. And so building on the work of Josiah Heyman, I put forward a different, if not much simpler argument, that faced with dwindling economic circumstances and scant occupational opportunities, the decision to join La Migra is for Latinos purely instrumental and at bottom about little more than basic economic self-interest. But this isn't just informed by my own experience of living on the border, but the prevailing socioeconomic circumstances of Latinos in, to borrow from the language of migration, the communities that send Latinos into immigration work. And in these communities, we see that not just in the current political moment, but historically, Latinos have consistently lagged behind all other racial and ethnic groups with respect to high school education, college completion, and median household income. But as dismal a picture as these data paint of the socioeconomic status of Latinos across the United States, the dynamics of inequality are even more pronounced in the predominantly Latino communities where agencies like Border Patrol and ICE typically recruit their personnel. Communities that consistently rank among the highest in terms of poverty and unemployment and lowest in terms of economic mobility. A case in point, my home, the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. Shout out to everybody who's there, possibly on the call. In the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, the percentage of people living in poverty ranks among the highest in the nation at rates between 33 and 35%, more than twice the nationwide average. And the unemployment rate consistently outpaces the national average. In this community and others like it, where Latino median household income averages just over $32,000 a year, the decision to apply for and accept a position with Border Patrol, an agency that offers a starting salary of $52,000 a year and generous benefits, is likely uncomplicated by considerations of ethnic identity, identification with the immigrant experience, and particular attitudes toward immigration. And it's with that in mind that I put together this research project and approached the questions at the heart of this study. So to get at these questions, do Latinos self-select into immigration law enforcement because of particular attitudes, particular predispositions, or is it merely a matter of socioeconomic status, about economic mobility and self-interest? To test this, I employed a qualitative methodological approach. I did this because I wanted, what this means is that I spent actual time in the field interviewing and observing, as Marisa mentioned before, the people who actually do the work of immigration law enforcement. And the point of this was that I wanted a deeper understanding of the people that were doing this work. I wanted to be able to spend time with them, have extended conversations with them, and really just kind of watch them. To that end, I spent 13 months between Arizona, Texas, and California between November 2014 and December 2015. And utilizing what's called multiple entry snowball sampling, a way of actually accessing people, I conducted interviews with 100 Immigration and Customs Enforcement ERO agents across Arizona, California, and Texas with a oversampling of Latino agents, right? The primary population that I was interested in talking to. Interviews were conducted in field offices, agents' homes, restaurants, coffee shops, and bars. The interviews themselves also averaged around 74 minutes in length, ranging from as short as 30 minutes among the more monosyllabic respondents, and up to 3 hours in length among some of the more candid of agents, I should say. And they were semi-structured to allow for comparison across the cases. What that means is that I walked into these interviews with a particular set of questions that I knew I wanted to ask, so that I would be able to compare answers between each individual. But at the same time, I would also allow interviews to take on lives of their own and allow the agents themselves to actually just speak. Again, as Luis mentioned, this is a perspective that we have rarely seen before. To date, this is the largest and most diverse study of immigration law enforcement agents ever conducted, and this is something I'm quite proud of. In fact, I still don't know how I managed to do this. And I would venture to say that in the current political moment, I would not be able to replicate this study. In my attempts to contact agents for follow-up interviews and to kind of get a sense of where these agents are after the Trump administration, or after the Trump administration has been in place for the last several years, most agents have been very reticent to speak to me. So what does the data look like? Well, in this case here is a demographic overview of the cases. And you'll note here at the very bottom of the highlighted column that the people I'm speaking about here are the 61 Latino agents who participated in my study, right? I'm not including the non-Latino agents here, which comprise 39 of the 100 agents that I interviewed. And I've got obviously the demographic data kind of broken down here on these rows. What you might immediately note, though, again in that highlighted section, is the number of agents who are foreign-born themselves, and thus immigrants, and those who, including those 10 who are foreign-born, are the children of immigrants. 67%, a majority of the agents that I interviewed were either the children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. So what did I find? Part of the initial task of trying to tease out the effects of self-selection or economic self-interest was essentially ruling out self-selection. And so in order to do that, I categorized the agents that I interviewed on two very basic, if not somewhat crude measures, just to get a sense of the extent to agents' particular attitudes toward immigration. And so taking a holistic view of the entirety of agents' interviews, classifying them either as holding liberal immigration attitudes or what we might think of as restrictionist immigration attitudes. I'd be more than happy, of course, to talk about how these categorizations were handled and the precise rubric that was used to put them in these spots. But in the interest of saving time, I'm going to keep moving forward here. I also classified them on their connection to or identification with the immigrant experience, simplified to classify high or low levels of connection to or identification with the immigrant experience. When I put these two measures together and essentially cross-tabbed them, this is a very simplified test, essentially, of self-selection. Because if we buy the argument that Latinos who enter immigration law enforcement may do so because they hold restrictionist attitudes, or they lack a strong connection to the immigrant experience or the people that they encounter on a daily basis in their jobs, we would expect everybody to fall into that bottom right quadrant circled right now with that red line. To complicate matters, though, that's not what happens. That's not actually what I found. And I found that agents actually are spread out. There's much more variation in the kinds of connections that agents express to having with the immigrant experience and their support for particular policy prescriptions and the kinds of attitudes that they hold, not just about immigration generally, but about undocumented immigrants and the act of crossing into the United States illicitly. In fact, what I find more than not is that across the spectrum of immigration attitudes, the majority of people, the majority of the Latino agents I interviewed cited economic motivations, specific economic motivations for their applying for and accepting the position. This is to say, regardless of the particular immigration attitudes that these agents had, or have, excuse me, economic motivations were the driving force across the board. In the case of connections to the immigrant experience, we see a similar pattern. Regardless of a low or high connection to the immigrant experience, economic motivations were the primary motivating factor behind Latino agents' decisions to apply for and accept positions in immigration law enforcement. So what did this look like? Well, in their own words, agents actually reinforced this. Carla Linares actually said about her accepting a job with Border Patrol after 6 months of teaching. She said, in my hometown, it's either law enforcement, teaching, or nursing. To her, this was just a job that was available. This was the best available job for her. Sonia Duran, who dreamed of doing fashion design and explained that she had put in for every job possible, said, I was adamant about getting a good government, getting a government job. I promised myself whatever job comes up, I'm taking. What is the best paying job here in the border region at the time? I don't quite have the education to be a doctor or anything like that, or a teacher, but I can do this. Lalo Rivera, who worked for a beer wholesaler before turning to immigration law enforcement for quote unquote career, said it's about what's going to provide for your family. You know, that's it. Yeah, it'd be nice to have a career where you look forward to going to work every day, but when that golden eagle shits in your account every 2 weeks and you see how much it's leaving, you're like, all right, it's like you're paying me this much for that. Daniel Mireles, who in many ways reminded me of a lot of the guys that I grew up with in Brownsville, who went off to the military when I went off to college. He was an Army veteran and explained how ICE offered a career without the need for a college degree, said, it's just a job to me, you know? It's not something that I wanted to do, that I wanted to fight illegal immigration. It's just something that the opportunity opened itself. I mean, I do my job. I do it as best as I can, but I'm not going to sell my soul to it. Again, trying to reinforce for me that this wasn't about his connection to immigration or his particular attitudes towards immigration, nor was it about his ethnic identity. In many ways, actually, Daniel described his identity as a trans-border identity, having grown up along the border and crossing the US-Mexico border every day as a kid to go to school. Claudio C.J. Juarez, also a military veteran and veteran of both ICE and Border Patrol. When I asked if he was particularly interested in working in law enforcement, working in immigration law enforcement, what is it that drew you to this line of work? He said that his sights were actually a little lower than that. It wasn't about law enforcement. I was just hoping for a federal job. I applied for the post office. I just wanted to get in with the government. I wanted those benefits. I wanted something secure with benefits that I could support myself and my family. Growing up on the border, government jobs were the gold standard. If you could get a government job, you know, those folks that I knew, they lived on the nice side of town. They lived good, you know? So I started applying everywhere. Sylvia Newman, who described selling jewelry, selling cars, and working at CVS prior to applying for a job with ICE, said, I was a single parent. That's why I got this job. I had just gotten divorced and had a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I needed a job with a little more security. So I started applying. I just went to all the federal agents to see, you know, like what the qualifications were, and I just started applying. And then the ICE application started going through. Sylvia actually represented, in this case, the stories of a lot of the agents that I interviewed in describing entry into immigration law enforcement almost as happenstance, almost as if this was just a consequence of the fact that ICE called first. That while they had all these job applications out there, this was the first opportunity that was offered to them. In fact, no, excuse me. From one interview to the next, Latino agents described the lack of substantive employment opportunities and high levels of poverty where they lived, and how those patterns in their own lives shaped their entry into immigration law enforcement. Many explicitly citing money, a stable job, and benefits as the specific reason for applying, right? So analysis of the interview data reveals little empirical evidence for the assumption that Latinos self-select into immigration enforcement. What the data does reveal, though, is the broader effects of racially and ethnically stratified inequality. In areas along the US-Mexico border where Latinos are more likely to experience low educational attainment, high unemployment, and dwindling economic opportunities, the decision to accept a position in immigration appears to have little to do with considerations of identity and much more to do with basic economic self-interest. So what do we do with this? Trust that I ask this question on a daily basis as the author of this work. But there are really two central implications to these findings. The first one's the boring one probably to a lot of you, and it's that, well, these findings fill an empirical gap. We now have a better sense within academia of why it is that Latinos enter immigration law enforcement, and helps clarify what have seemed like before now somewhat anomalous findings that suggested that Latinos who work in immigration might not all be restrictionists, might not all feel disassociated from their ethnic identity, and might, in some cases, have a strong connection to the immigrant experience. If we take this as an example, and the fact that we know that economic inequality, and we can assume that economic inequality tracks along particular attitudes about immigration, then we can expect that uniformity among those Latinos who enter immigration law enforcement is not necessarily guaranteed. But that's the boring response, right? This is the academic exercise. More importantly, though, these findings suggest a failure of policies toward Latino communities. These findings call on us to question why Latinos see immigration law enforcement as among their only fruitful options, and to push for a paradigm shift from border militarization to revitalization. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Very much appreciate that insight and knowledge. We have some time for some Q&A. We've had some great questions pop both into the question and answer section, as well as into the chat. So to start us off, one thing that stood out for folks is the question about gender and gender identity, to make something even more intersectional. Did you find that gender plays any role in whether Latinx choose to work in immigration law enforcement, or in how they are perceived?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much. This is actually the subject of a chapter in my forthcoming book manuscript, where I look at how ethnic identity, or Latino identity, gender identity, and migra identity, or identity as immigration law enforcement agencies intersect in the course of agents' institutions. And what I find is that gender and expectations about particular gender norms, what is considered appropriate behavior for women, what is considered appropriate behavior for men, for mothers, and for fathers, that this actually moderates to some degree, or at least shapes the way that a lot of Latinos interact with co-ethnic migrants, right? Migrants that they might otherwise see themselves as very connected to. And in many cases, they describe seeing themselves in their clientele, that the gender distinction, right? The frame of gender actually serves to distinguish themselves. It's used as an operative cleavage to separate themselves, to distinguish themselves from migrants they might otherwise see themselves as connected to. That's a great question. Thank you.
Another question, kind of going back to what you touched on a little bit, but how in the world did you get to talk to so many agents? Were they willing to talk, or were they no longer in agencies when you spoke with them?
That's another great question. I still struggle to figure out how I made this happen. Really, I had great mentorship at the time. You know, an advisor at the time who was telling me, if there's any time in the world to be shameless, it's now. So make yourself available, show up to field offices, and don't let them turn you away. So I would say that that was one of the first things that helped me get over, you know, the feelings of shame or apprehension about making contact with people. But ultimately, if you noticed my headshot from the beginning of the talk, I used to just have a clean shaven face. I also used to wear a mustache, which, you know, I hoped would endear me to law enforcement agents. And I spent a lot of time prior to actually reaching out to them, learning their language, learning their acronyms, in a way that I could ingratiate myself to them. Not to mention explaining that the purpose of my study was to understand them better, was to get their side of the story. And to give them, as I mentioned before, the space to actually share those stories. Now, that's not to say that every agent was willing to talk to me. I did have agents, you know, either forget to call me back or tell me that they would come back and see me in the lobby of a federal building, you know, in an hour. Or, you know, agents who would just flat out say, I don't want to talk to you. But in a lot of cases, what I found was that agents wanted to share their stories. They were eager to speak to someone that they could in a lot of cases, actually open up to, kind of pull down some of their barriers. And as you all might be interested to know, is also another chapter in my forthcoming book. They were interested in talking to somebody that they could reveal how difficult a time they have in their job. Because non-Latino colleagues were not the place that they could take that kind of conversation. In many of these cases, agents recognized me as a co-ethnic and were willing to open up about how tough it was to police the behavior, police the very act that made them who they are, that brought them to be where they are in their current life. And so there was almost an element of, almost wanting to talk to me more than I was asking people to. By the end of the study, I was literally turning people away, which was a fascinating development. Great question, though. Thank you.
That ties into a few other questions we've received, both about folks that are agents of other ethnic backgrounds, particularly about Black agents and their role in the Border Patrol, if there's any scholarly research on that in particular, and then the real impact of what it might be to come across as a vendido, or the toll with other co-ethnics and what that might mean for agents.
That's a great question. Those are two great questions. The first, I would, direct people to, if they're interested in knowing more about how kind of the agency has diversified to some extent beyond just Latinos, I would look at Kelly Lytle Hernandez's work, who's a historian, in her book Migra, or hopefully you'll wait a little bit more for my book to come out, in which one of the chapters I actually trace the development of immigration law enforcement agencies over time. And this is kind of derived from my archival research in the USCIS library, looking at mentions of non-white agents in government documents, in agency documents, starting in 1924 all the way through the early 2000s. There are Black agents in my sample here, and they were, though, a minority of cases among the non-Latino agents. I have not dived into that and done a broader analysis of how those agents might differ from non-Latino whites, but that's something definitely worth considering. To the second question, which was, if I can restate it here for you, just to clarify, was how agents deal with charges of being vendidos or race traders. Was that the question?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a huge part of what it was that I was studying, right? I wanted to understand how Latino immigration agents understood themselves, right? That's a broader kind of part of the research agenda. And it's where my book project ultimately goes once we clarify this initial question of why they enter in the first place. Because the way that I describe ultimately the work of immigration law enforcement among Latinos is essentially a lived experience of in-betweenness, almost calling on Gloria Anzaldua's notion of this kind of liminal identity, right, of border dwellers. And I wanted to understand how that identity functions in the way that they interact, not just with their Latino, with co-ethnic migrants, but with their non-Latino peers, and then at home with family members or with people whom they share, in a lot of cases, the same community with. Agents would describe going to the grocery store and seeing people that they'd previously deported, which was just a fascinating bit of insight into almost the parallel lives of the Latinos that work immigration and the Latino migrants trying to find economic, security and mobility in coming to the United States. And it's for that reason that during the talk, I borrow the language of migration to talk about the sending communities, right, of the Latinos who go into immigration. And it's typically in these moments in their home communities, in interactions with family members, that they talked about the extent to which there were challenges on who they were and what they did, right? On being called out on the floor for being race traitors or perros vendidos, or that they had forgotten where they came from. And there were some agents who pushed back against that and said, I haven't forgotten where I came from. I'm very much connected to who I am. This is just a job. Again, kind of referencing again the use of this job in an instrumental way, right? This is about my economic survival, my economic security. And there were other agents who would then say, they're right. This isn't, there's nothing wrong in what they're saying. They're absolutely right. But in many cases, those agents would turn around again and point back to the economic side of this and say, but what am I supposed to do? If I'm not doing this, what am I going to do? Again, pointing us back to the fact that at root, this is a public policy problem. Thank you for the question.
Excellent. And I definitely want to offer that same question to Luis. This is coming particularly from another one of our board members at Hope, Dr. Mark Lusk. And his question specifically is, what are your thoughts about moral injury among Latinx ICE and Border Patrol officers who pursue Latino migrants? And this is something that Francisco Cantu wrote of in The Land Becomes a River. So from a moral perspective, what are any insights you can provide? I think you're on mute, Dr. Fraga. Let me see. I think you're on mute, Dr. Fraga. Can you hear me?
I think one way to think of this is to understand that at some point there has to be a reconciliation. One can continue, as David is suggesting, live and live and live and have these double lives and so forth. But I have to think that at some point there is this sense of having to reconcile these contradictions in how some of the agents, and I'm taking this largely from David's work, how some of the agents understand their work and how they understand themselves as Latinx people, if not understand themselves as immigrants, if not understand themselves as children of immigrants, because of the people they're working with. And David has some fascinating data about how they try to reach this reconciliation and how this reconciliation is reached. Let me give you one example that I've learned from David. The example that I learned from David was some of these agents will try to reposition themselves within the agency so they're not involved in active border enforcement. They're involved in processing. They're involved in supporting. They're involved in other very important roles that the Border Patrol is involved in, but less in the, if you will, law enforcement components of what it is that they do. Now, that doesn't achieve the reconciliation and their own moral values and moral virtues, but that certainly is a way to try to come closer to reconciling that inconsistency. The moral vulnerability that these agents, especially the Latino agents, are under, and maybe even the progressive non-Latino agents, the moral vulnerability they have chosen to place themselves in is dramatic. And I have to think that at one point they've got to come to terms with it in some very meaningful way, whether it's through religion or through some other type of self-reflection. They've got to come to terms with it and say, not just it's a job, that's a very important part of it, but also say, this is how I try to do my job and remain true to who I and my family are.
Absolutely. We have a few more questions, but I know we're at the hour. So just a few last minute reminders. Thank you everybody who is repping the 956, the 915, and all the other area codes that we have out representing our communities. We want to think a little bit about what was the impact, if any, of the economic recession of 2008? How did that affect Latinx hires in both ICE and Border Patrol?
So I would say that within the hires, I actually don't have that data in front of me. It's accessible, it's available to me, that I have it somewhere, but don't have that in front of me. What we do know for sure, though, is that the economic recession, if we think back to the slides that I shared of the economic circumstances of Latinos over time, the economic recession of 2008, 2009 was particularly strong or impactful among Latinos across the country. Because of their position in the socioeconomic structure, they were hardest hit typically by the recession and were slower to recover from it. So we could imagine, we could envision, right, that again, the allure of a job that pays as well as it does without the need for college degree is strong. Not to mention the kind of propaganda that we have in places like the Rio Grande Valley or in other places along the border in El Paso. Billboards, right? TV commercials, pushing the beautiful like landscape of the border, and come the way that actually, because you mentioned him, Francisco Cantu describes playing out in the dirt. That this notion of riding horses or ATVs, or Rick Perry even went out on a boat on the Rio Grande, to show the awesome life of Border Patrol agents. So we can't discount that either.
Got it. I think with that, coming to the current political reality and maybe how they've seen their own role change, is there any insight as to what their experiences have been now in this administration? You've mentioned that they've kind of dropped off and haven't been as engaged, but if we circle back to what Luis raised at the beginning, the separation of children from their families and this desire to be rough and tumble, adventurous in the Wild West with being human and a caretaker of migrants. What is the connection there, and how has that been expressed at all by any of the agents you've been in touch with?
It has. That's a fantastic question. One of the agents that I highlight in the forthcoming book, by the end of our conversation, talked about, I'm leaving. I'm quitting this job. He literally said, this is not to put down anybody who loves this job or really likes what they do, but I can't see myself doing this anymore. And when he said that, he followed that up with, I'm an immigrant. I know why these people come here. I know what these people are doing because my family did it. And he said, so he said, I've even told my wife, I can't see myself doing this for much longer. I verified with, in that case, the tension of kind of the conflict of who he was and what he did was boiling over. And I have verified through other contacts in the agency that he did leave after another 3 years. Actually, it took a little while for him to finally do that. For other agents, they manage ways, as Professor Fraga mentioned, to kind of mitigate the opportunities for their ethnic identity or who they are and what they do to come into conflict with one another. And they opt into particular units like that, right? And basically in an attempt to keep the water from boiling over the side of the pot. One of those agents in particular that I spoke with shortly after we started seeing in the last couple of years video and hearing audio out of detention centers with children crying who had been separated from their parents under the zero tolerance policy. When I reached out to him, pardon my language, but I literally said, hey, it looks like the shit's really hitting the fan. How are you doing? And he said, well, I think we may be on the wrong side of history. And I said, do you ever think about quitting? And he said, hi to the perrito. He said, I would, but the money's still too good. I can't pass it up. And then he said one of the most terrifyingly stark things that I've ever heard from these agents. He said, "I'll leave when we start gassing people." He reinforced what his moral limit was in that conversation. But it's this kind of identity work, this kind of boundary making, metaphorical boundary making, that these agents engage in on a daily basis to deal with this conflict. Somebody I just saw wrote in the chat that this is heartbreaking, and it's true. By no means with this work do I mean to paint these people out to be saints, because they're not. They are engaged, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, in an ongoing racial project that continues to tie Latino identity to criminality, that does nothing but reinforce what President Trump says about people from Mexico. But at the same time, there's a real tragedy to this story. And I'm reminded of a song that was adapted by a son jarocho band from Austin, Texas, of Willie Nelson's Mamas Don't Let Your Babies Grow Up to Be Cowboys, and turned that into Mamas Don't Let Your Mijos Grow Up to Be La Migra. And I think that that is where we need to move. And in here is a broader discussion to be had about the Abolish ICE movement. But what I think this research highlights is that before we can actually do that, we have to think about what we might do instead for our border communities.
Thank you, David. I want to offer any last words. Luis, anything you want to share as we wrap up and conclude, reminding people there's so many questions that have come into the chat. This is a riveting topic. We're incredibly grateful and appreciative to the Institute for Latino Studies and the University of Notre Dame. Folks are waiting with bated breath for your book, David. No push there, but we'll, God willing, be able to host a follow-up webinar as part of its launch and release, and would love
So is my wife.
We should.
My wife is too.
So we would look forward to that, but I want to offer you both any last words before we close.
All of this points to how critical our next presidential election is. There's no doubt the current White House administration has exacerbated, although it's part of a long tradition, it's exacerbated the severity of harm, blatant harm, and blatant dehumanization of immigrants and immigrant communities, with a focus on Latino communities that will only become worse depending on the outcome of the presidential election. The last thing I want to, so we need to think about what it is each of us can do if our political preferences are to limit this dehumanization and limit this harm, this hurt, this pain inflicted. When we were there at the Jornada por la Justicia with the folks at Hope, and we had the chance to go over the border in Mexico, you could see, ironically, the tremendous aspirations of migrants who wanted to try to come across the border, who were fearful for their lives in their home communities. Fearful because of narco trafficking, fearful because of assault, fearful for a variety of reasons, and the fact that they had very little opportunity to do that under the policies and practices of the current administration. That's not the United States at its best, that's the United States at its worst. And our hope and our prayer is that we can try to use this as a way to help mobilize people to say, this is not the type of leadership that we want. We want a type of leadership that is much more understanding of the complexities that exist in people trying to come across the border. And as David's research suggests, those who work in this particular area. I do want to say as a last point, this is the type of work we do at the Institute for Latino Studies. Having a fabulous faculty fellow like David Cortez doing cutting edge work on behalf of better understanding Latino communities with immediate policy implications, political implications, and moral implications is what we try to do every day at the Institute for Latino Studies at Notre Dame. So it is a great privilege. Thank you, Marisa. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, all the HOPE staff, for being able to share David and his work with you. And I'm very, very thankful to David for his willingness to do this.
Any last thoughts, David?
I just also like to reiterate, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to share this work. Every time I do and receive questions, I'm reinvigorated and reminded that this is research worth doing. So I just want to say thank you for the invitation, and thank you for all of you who are on the call, listening and sending in your questions. I hope to see them still and incorporate them into my thinking. And lastly, Black Lives Matter.
They absolutely do. Black Lives Matter. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you'll go to hopeorder.org, make sure you sign up for our newsletter. You will receive tons of different content that I think will help illuminate your journey as a social justice advocate. We're incredibly grateful to David Cortez and Luis Fraga for their wisdom and insight, research, and scholarly efforts, the Institute for Latino Studies at the University of Notre Dame. We know that this is incredibly important work. We're proud to play some small part in it, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. Hope Order Institute is on all your favorite social media platforms with the exception of TikTok to date, and we are excited and hoping that you are well, that you stay safe, and that you have a restful weekend. Thank you so much for joining us and being part of this wonderful webinar.